Welcome to Winston's Cellar. Relax, listen, enjoy. Chapter 18. The Battle of Ceres. Malg-Dantu lounged within the depths of its Spore-kin's dwelling. The great void coral palace was one of the 79 that dotted the harsh frozen surface of Ceres, one for each of the 79 clans of Ceres who ruled the Belt of Sol. It was a perfect domain for Malg-Dantu's kin, barren and distant from the system star, minerals rich and filled with tunnels and caverns perfect for slaves and spawns. The Ceres were an ancient species with a history spanning million years. In that time, empires and species had risen and fallen. All throughout the Ceres had waxed and waned, surviving and existing in the dark, fetid parts of the galaxy like the molds they were distantly related to. During galactic dark ages, they prospered and fed upon the remnants of broken civilizations. Now was one of those times of plenty. The meatlings of terror had been broken by their automata, and the endless empire of the Crystal Children had been dragged screaming into the nether. As the fires of those twin apocalyptic conflicts cooled, the Ceres had slithered into the former crown worlds of the Terran meatlings. The meatlings bred quickly, and even the greatest cataclysm in their history had done little to quell their numbers. Lacking the legions of iron that had once defended them, they were easy prey for Malg-Dantu's kin. For as long as the story murals recorded, the Ceres had been the masters of breaking lesser species to their will. The enslavement and exploitation of other sentients had long ago been perfected by Malg-Dantu's ancestors, and the continuation of such a practice was quite useful. Terran meatlings in particular proved to be the virtually perfect slave species. It amused the Ceres that the species that had once claimed dominion over the stars proved such excellent fodder for their industries, agriculture, and subservience. Terrans bred quickly, even in the most odious conditions. They could survive and thrive on the most basic scraps. They could even be manipulated to turn on each other for better pickings of refuse to squash rebellion. Unlike the orcs or other fast-breeding races, they could be easily broken into obedient slaves. Terran tissue was also quite nutritious, and their warp signature seemed to attract the attention of the Four from the beyond, making sacrifices of their nether touched an excellent source of boons. They truly were the ideal slave species. Malg-Dantu itself was waited on by 100 fanatically loyal meatlings, who all competed for the honor of having their cerebral spinal fluid drank by their master. The Spore clan of Malg owned 89,602,819 Terran slaves, with a few 100,000 more used for sustenance or materials. From its Xeno perspective, Malg-Dantu knew without a doubt Terrans were inferior livestock, and that the enslavement and consumption of them would continue until every last one of them had been used up. Malg-Dantu knew this because they would not be the first species to experience such a fate under the Ceres' use. What Malg-Dantu did not know was that the millennia of human enslavement and consumption was about to violently end, or that it was about to pay for its crimes with its life as a barrage of fire reduced its palace to ash. By their very nature, void ship lance weaponry strike first in a battle. This proved true as the first broadsides of hyper-focused energy burned through Ceres' defense field and unleashed hell upon the world below. Battle tank-sized bolts of light turned millennia worth of carefully grown void coral into a plasmatic slurry of its component atoms. The palace of Malg-Dantu had proved an optimum first target of the First Legion. The isolated equatorial plateau would provide baseline information on the effectiveness of the fleet's weapons. Scans also indicated the vast bulk of life forms matching human biological characteristics were located beneath the protoplanet's surface. The strike would decapitate enemy leadership without causing unnecessary harm to the enslaved humans. Lance fire lacerated the kilometer-high structure, leaving angular cuts that turned the thick layer of frost lacquered onto it into great clouds of vapor. Entire sections of the macrostructure were peeled away from the main spire and teetered precariously. As the vivisected structure started to settle from the devastation inflicted by Imperial energy weapons, the fleet's macro-cannon shells slammed into it. Megatons of explosive force shattered the palace into frozen shards that flitted through the void, affected partially by the rapidly decaying artificial gravity of the palace, forming a hauntingly beautiful spectacle of crystal snow floating between earthquake-inducing impacts. In less than 10 minutes, the once prideful center of Xeno-tyranny and all its occupants had been utterly destroyed by the First Legion. The first assault was a resounding success. The Xeno fortress was reduced to ash without issue, and the next phase of the battle had begun. Like the nest of vermin, it was the proto-planet had been stirred into a frenzy. Defensive shields shimmered into being over the remaining spires. These were not the faint containment fields, meant to simulate an atmosphere and protect from cosmic debris, but barriers of eldritch energy and distorted space-time. At Eddard's command, the fleet opened fire on the other targetable fortress. 3 folded under the bombardment, their barriers not solidified enough to withstand the Imperium's wrath. The other 20 were luckier, and the shields shimmered with sickly light as they halted the bombardment. Even so, Armageddon rained down upon the barriers, straining them and preventing any orbital defenses from being fired. This did not prevent swarms of Xeno fighter craft from pouring out of their hives. The fields reacted to momentum and would not block low-velocity objects from entering or exiting it, confirming what he had expected. The first Primarch gave the much-anticipated order to his legion: ready drop pods for deep strike insertion. Thousands of legionnaires entered their drop pods and prepared to be launched like living ordnance down onto Ceres. 100 or so battle brothers of the 8th Formation boarded their strike craft and took formation as squad leaders of auxiliar, piloted fighter squadrons. They would defend the fleet and their battle brothers from the oncoming Xeno horde. Bolts of energy and mass-reactive shells spilled into the void as the fleet's defenses came to life. Tens of thousands of Xeno fighters had already poured into the void and were beginning to open fire with energy weapons. Even in massive volleys, the scorching Xeno weapons could not threaten Imperial void shields. Still, they fired, all while coalescing towards the Twenty Primarchs. Similar to the Astartes' drop pods that thundered past them, the Xenos sought to decapitate the enemy. Not a single one got close enough to even touch the Gloriana-class's void shield. Deadly storms of flak fire and masterful pilots of the 8th Formation ripped them out of the void. It was now when the nature of the Xeno fighters were revealed by Imperial strike craft observation. The Xeno fighter craft were not craft at all, but individual specimen of the enemy. At about 8 foot long and sprouting many foul protrusions, the horrific bilaterally symmetrical beings flew through the void on some unknown ether with fan-like wings. In its tendrils they held queer-directed energy weapons that lashed out with vivid bolts that tore through the armor of any strike craft unlucky enough to be hit. As the orbital battle between strike craft and Xeno intensified, the first drop pods slammed into Ceres' surface. Control rockets had directed and slowed the pods to safely pass through the Xeno Palace's force field. Hundreds of drop pods smashed into and around each spire. With practiced efficiency, the Astartes exited their transports and secured the perimeter around their craft. The vast majority of the drop pods had landed within 100 meters of the base of the spire. A few struck directly into it, though. Those battle brothers had the somewhat more arduous duty of setting up internal kill zones to occupy and distract defenders while the main force moved in. Once the landing forces had decided it was reasonably safe, a signal was transmitted back to the fleet. Specialized Astartes from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 7th formations were then deployed with their war gear and vehicles. 20 independent armies of Astartes, each numbering in the thousands, formed up. Columns of the newly manufactured Jenny Rhino transports and Predator tanks deployed. Squads formed up into companies and companies into chapters. 3rd Formation scout craft quickly moved to scan the Xeno structure and access enemy forces and access points. Orbital scans indicated each spire was an entry point into a sprawling catacomb system of both human and Xeno origin. Taking these 20 spires would provide access to the protoplanet's core. The 3rd Formation's initial reports indicated the spires themselves were sparsely populated, more akin to a mix of pleasure palace and fortress than a proper city. As of now, the majority of their defenders were engaging in the orbital battle, but more would soon be spilling out of the planet's crust once the Astartes assault was noticed. This was the key point of the battle for Ceres. The First Legion had to take the spires quickly and butcher the Xenos before they could mount a defense. The location marked by Imperial tacticians as Spire 5 was the first to be breached by the Legion. It was one of the larger Xeno structures, and its entrance was a broad avenue leading to a semi-organic-looking aperture. The other spires tended to have high-up tubular access points with a few larger ones that seemed to be loading dock equivalents. The design was perfect for armored vehicles, and a unit of 4th Formation tanks and transports carrying 5th Formation Astartes charged the gate. Once they were within a few hundred meters, the reason for the atypical entrance point became apparent. The hab-block-sized aperture opened up, and 24 hulking beasts rampaged out of it. Oily, tentacled creatures, each rivaling a rhino in size. Festooned with brutal armor and blades attached to their extremities, the monster was ready for battle. On each specimen back was its Xeno handler. The Curel, grasping tendrils, each held some sort of energy weapon, and they were protected by an armored howdah. Fully utilizing the mobility advantage provided by their quadruped ape-like stance, the creatures charged the Astartes' armored division. With practiced certainty, the Rhino transports moved themselves and their cargo out of the creatures' reach and behind their predator siblings, all while firing into the pack of monsters with their storm bolters. Taking up frontline positions, the predators blasted away at the war beasts. Even under a hail of bolt shells and auto-cannon blasts, the creatures did not falter. Their armor rippled with oily light that muted the destructive power being unleashed against them. Even so, the great volume of mass-reactive shells filling the air managed to rip through the Xeno armor and explode inside the war beasts. Instead of bleeding or breaking like a fully natural creature, the war beast's flesh oozed over the injury like a grotesque fluid. One of the more massive specimens reared up and brought its armored forelimbs down on a predator's turret. Its rider's weapons unleashed etheric tendrils of electricity that crackled and lashed out at the tank's armor. Barely dodging the crackling power claws bonded to the war beast's flesh. As it sunk through the turret's armor, the tank's lead gunner aimed its autocannon into the beast's chest. With an explosive crack, the round blasted through the creature's chest cavity and detonated as it reached the beast's spine equivalent and back armor. A mixture of organic and metal shrapnel spewed out of its back and reduced the war beast's rider to a fine paste. Instantly, the war beast pulled away as if the predator's hull scalded it. Backing away with twitchy movements, the creature slumped forward, its head pressed against the frozen rock of Ceres. It took a moment for the tank's crew to decipher the alien body language of what they had assumed was a brutish, gene-crafted animal. It was bowing, a near-universal mark of supplication and respect. A moment later, the grey, clammy flesh of the xeno-beast started to slort off of it. Wounds from both this battle and previous ones ripped open. Scars faded into being and became gaping injuries as the xeno died before their eyes. The patterns even upon such an alien form were unmistakable. Brands and lash marks that always accompanied slavery. This was no animal but a sentient being forced into violence and servitude that was so severe, even death could not be an escape. Some foul warp craft of xeno heresy forced the xeno slave to keep living and was dispelled with its master's death. Showing the initiative and understanding that had earned him his command, Tank Sergeant Hawkwood quickly voxed the other tank commanders. "Aim for the Xeno Riders. They are the source of the beast's resilience. They are just as much slaves as the mortals toiling below. Euthanize them efficiently." Reacting with startling speed, the 10 tanks of Hawkwood's division gained firing lines on the Curel riders and pulverized them with concentrated fire. The armor and shields of their diocese did little to stifle the vengeance of mankind. Soon, all that was left of the 12 slave Xenos were malformed skeletons quickly covering with void frost. A marker beacon for the Xenos biologists was deployed on them, and the tanks advanced upon the gate. Bolts of energy from turrets hidden in the void coral flew down upon them. A quick hail of bolter fire quickly silenced them, and the gaping entrance to the spire awaited. It appeared the Xenos had attempted to shut the bastion once they realized the battle had turned against them. A few stray bolt shells had turned the fleshy aperture into a wound in the spire's side. Assembling quickly, the Astartes prepared to march into the spire. A cohort of Astartes numbering in at 5,000 battle brothers, along with armored transports, tanks, flyers, attack bikes, mech suits, specialty forces and support Astartes, prepared to enter the spire. Doom and destruction was coming the Xenos, and liberation in life or peace in death was coming to their victims. They were the Emperor's angels of death, and they would know no fear.